Hello, everyone. I'm today in this virtual room with Professor Anthony Carty for what is our third dialogue. As you know, we've initiated a series of exchange where we discuss contemporary issues of international law and international legal theory. Today, we will be discussing the use of history in international legal thought and international legal literature, and we'll offer some critical reflections on the so-called turn to history. And maybe to kick off our discussion, I would like to to say a few words on the so-called turn to history, which we have allegedly witnessed in the international legal literature over the last 25 years. It's now common to say that possibly initiated by Marty Koskiniemi's book on the gentle civilized nation, international lawyers have grown more interested and more sensitive to history. And this is what we call the turn to history. And this has indeed materialized in new journals. We have now a journal on the history of international law. We also have new series. As we all know now, there is an Oxford series on the history of international law. So this turn to history is not only a discursive posture. It has materialized in a number of outputs. And so I think that makes it worth a few reflection. Maybe the preliminary reflection that I'd like to offer is maybe a question about whether this turn to history in that we've witnessed in the last 25 years really is a turn to history, in the sense that, in my view, international lawyers have always been historicizing. I mean, using past facts, past documents, past archive, past discourses is how we build legal argumentation. Legal argumentation is always rest on some kind of past. Legal argumentation always requires the mobilization of some past to create authority in the present with a view to influencing the future. So if by history we mean the use of the past, I think that international lawyers have always been historians. So I would be a bit reluctant to call this, to actually exaggerate the importance of this turn to history, because I do think that plowing into the past has always been the normal business of international lawyer. Maybe what is specific to what we've been witnessing in the last 25 years is a greater sensitivity towards the way we discourse and we theorize the past. Right? So in that sense, this turn to history is less a turn to history than a turn to historiography. I think what starting with certainly Marty Koskiniemi, but also very much influenced by the work of people like Van Orford, I think what we've seen is a greater interest in the way and in the strategies through which the past is constructed by international lawyers, and constructed means also written. The past is written in the present to achieve certain goals, and I do think that what this means is a greater interest for historiography, for the writing of history, for the techniques of writing, for the strategies of writing, for the hegemonies that inform the writing of the past, which is used by international lawyers. And in saying this, I also think that this turn to history, which I think is a turn to historiography, is a continuation of critique. I think critique has necessitated a hard look on the past, and it's no coincidence, I think, that we've seen flourishing literature on law and empire, on law and hegemony. And I do think that the critique of contemporary hegemonies necessitate a critique about the discourse on history and the discourse on the past. So just to put it in more concrete terms, I do think that critique has called for a turn to historiography. Being critical has necessitated that we take a hard look at the way in which we write the past and we write about the past. And so that's all this to say that I think when we speak about a turn to history, we may want to be a bit more rigorous and a bit more precise. I think what we're speaking about is a greater historiographical sensibility. That's what it is. So we have this turn to history, which I think is a turn to historiography, which has been now with us for 20 years. And now I would like to turn to Professor Anthony Carty, because obviously Professor Carty has always made a great use of the past, of past authors, of past ideas. And if you take the decade of international law, I mean, history is very central in that work. So Tony, that's the question I would like to ask you is, how do you look at this turn to history? Because I think in your view, history has always been there and has always been very central in the work of international law. So what do you think of these people saying that there has been a turn to history in the last 20 years? What does someone like you, who's always considered history very central, think about this self-portrayal of what international lawyers do?
Well, I think the question you put is very stimulating and appropriate. And my immediate reaction, again, I find your questions always stimulating. My immediate reaction is to challenge the idea that there has been any turn to history. Maybe there are new histories, but I mean, if I go back very briefly to the decay, the context of that was the historical tradition created by the Carnegie Foundation, the Carnegie Classics in International Law. And I was familiar with them as an undergraduate because they're in every decent law library in the United Kingdom. And we would see Grotius, Vattel, Pufendorf, Ankerschog, and Zuch, Gentili, Suarez, Vittoria, and all the rest of them. And I thought it would be fun to read these because I really preferred, quite capriciously, prepared to study history than to study law, but law seemed to be more practical. So I was combining the two quite capriciously for my own terms of personal interest. And so when I asked Parry to supervise a study of Grotius, he pushed me in the direction of Vattel, as I've already mentioned. So one was immediately steeped in the history. And at the time, we had Alexandrovich, I think, editing the Grotius Society papers. So there was a Journal of the History of International Law. It disappeared with him in the middle of the 1970s, but we had a Journal of the History of International Law. O'Connell, who was professor of international law in Oxford until 1980, that's to say, during the whole time I was at Cambridge, he was, among other things, I think one of the greatest international lawyers of the 20th century, though completely forgotten as far as I can see. O'Connell was a historian of the 16th and the 17th century. He wrote many articles for the Grotius Society papers, and I think for some other journals as well. And he has written a biography of Richelieu and the contribution of Richelieu to the study of international law. Now, Kotkaniemi comes along 50 years later and says there was no international law in 17th century France. But you do have O'Connell as an international lawyer not agreeing. And there you have a high level of intellectual sophistication in his study of the relationship of positivism to natural law thinking. So you have you have the tradition around James Brown Scott, which you have a controversy about the historiography of international law, which is very important and partially comes out of David Kennedy and critical legal studies in Harvard. And this refers then back to an earlier wave where the history of international law was foundational, and Orford makes considerable representation of that. The importance of the Spanish tradition in getting international law going at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So I don't think there is a turn to history in the sense that there was a period where international lawyers were not interested in history. You have then a German, more positivist tradition of a study of international legal history going back to the Babylonians and beyond to Mesopotamia and Egypt and so on. They're following the argument that wherever you have independent societies, you're going to have some kind of law, like ubi. There's a Latin phrase there, ubi societe ibi rex or whatever. And wherever there's society, there will be law. So wherever there is international society, there will be international law. And so that is also a fairly forgotten tradition. So I think what we have in the historiography of international law is not so much a turn to history, but a tendency to amnesia about the historical tradition, a tendency to forget or to dismiss out of hand history, because you have the history, Epoche der Völkerrechtsgeschichte von Wilhelm Greve. I think that was published in 1984. The 600-page volume on the history of international law, which then was eventually translated into English. I don't remember what date it was translated into English, but that certainly preceded Marty's work. But of course, Marty and various other people, for various reasons, are completely dismissive. Stolleis in Frankfurt then would be completely dismissive of this type of history because, strangely enough, this is where we get bogged down in historiographical disputes. They would argue that basically Greve is writing about the history of the great powers and their impact, normative impact also, but their impact on international society. And that's not true international legal history. International legal history has to be about the profession and what the profession of international lawyers do. So that is one of the main themes of Marty's book. I think Marty's book accompanies the increasing fascination of international lawyers with themselves as a profession. It's quite specific. Otherwise, I think it's fascinating to explain how particular books become, or particular articles become signature articles and become central. That doesn't dispute their quality, but that the quality itself is not enough. It's the environment which receives the articles. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that you're raising a very interesting point that there's been a lot of forgetfulness, and that there were other waves, there were other turns to history, and I mean, I'm fascinated
Already
by
mentioning some of them. I mean, there's the Nice, I think that the Belgian international lawyer in the 19th century.
Yeah, actually, in that respect, so there is this sort of wave in the second half of the 20th century with Alexandrovich, O'Connell, Greve, but then also there is the other wave, which is the end of the 19th century, Nice, and early 20th century, James Brown Scott, and so on. But I must say, I might look at this 19th century, 20th century historical works a bit differently, or at least I wouldn't put them in the same basket, because it seems to me that these were less historical works than disciplinary works. Disciplinary in the sense that these were works meant to establish international law as a discipline. And for international law to be a discipline, it had to be, of course, structured. It needed institutions, but it needed historical narratives. And so the way I look at Nice and others, and James Brown Scott and so on in the late 19th century and beginning of 20th century is that these are is as follows: these are people who tried maybe less to do history than to build a discipline and to give the discipline some foundations. And the way to give it some foundation is to give it a sort of birth moment, a contract, an international contract, which is just in line with the modern idea of the social contract. It's Westphalia, it's two treaties between nations, and so on and so on. So what, I think these works, in a way, have a greater disciplinary value than historical values. And of course, later on, people came to say that Westphalia, when it comes to international law, is insignificant. It was just arbitrarily picked to give modern foundations to international law. But so that doesn't mean that the work of these people is irrelevant, but it's just, I find them more interesting in disciplinary terms, because they laid down the foundations of the discipline, rather than for the historical value. So maybe that's a different type of waves. It's maybe not a wave, it's the discipline constructing itself.
Well, I think that's extremely stimulating, and I hadn't thought of that at all. That Nice and then Brown Scott, they are helping to construct a discipline. But well, particularly with Brown Scott, I think he's also looking for an ideology, and I think that one can go back into the middle of the 19th century. I think Wheaton as well is both historian and an international lawyer. And the studies of history of international law, I think Walker at the beginning of the 19th century, the interest in history, I think, is part of the historical school generally. The 19th century believed that history was what gave meaning to social activity. And I think international lawyers also honed in on this dimension. But I think that it's tricky to break off and to say that there was maybe a short period between. Well, I can't even think of any period where there was no interest in the history of international law. But what I think I wanted to say was that when I did study on diplomatic history of international law in the 19th century, one had the triptych, I think, of balance of power, European public law, and international law. These were concepts that appeared in European treaties. And of course, this raises the question, and we haven't mentioned Nussbaum. I don't know whether that's stage fright on our part. But in fact, Nussbaum, sitting in 1952, is providing a kind of student textbook, History of International Law, which was crucial to making the subject studyable and a part of master's degree courses in international law. But when I looked at the treaty practice in the 19th century, this stimulated me to realize and to follow the instigation also from Parry that international law is actually a textbook construction constructed by Vattel, because if you go to the 19th century treaties, the international lawyers blather on all the time about legal practice, legal experience, that they're realists, they follow what the states are doing. But the states themselves in the 19th century, and of course I mean by that largely Europe and North America, they understand international law as having a very limited role. It means the law of the sea, aspects of prize law, diplomatic immunities, but the public order of Europe, which keeps Europe from destroying itself, that is the European public law, droit public de l'Europe, which I've sometimes thought that the European Journal of International Law was trying to resurrect that idea of droit public européen, European international law. And that is terribly important for understanding the way the discipline evolves. And I believe that you cannot separate, and this is why we end up having huge historiographical and methodological problems. You cannot separate the history of international law from philosophy. And I think the concept of the Germans, taken up also then by Randall Leshafer with his Cambridge History of International Law in about 25 to 30 volumes, there is the idea that communities, independent communities, will naturally generate a law between them. Well, this is a philosophical proposition. It's not a historical proposition. I mean, the opposing historical proposition is that independent communities tend to want to be hegemonic and gobble one another up, and they are not interested in coexistence. International law supposes coexistence. And if you take the example, it's fashionable now to say that the Westphalia was not seen by those at the time as foundational of the international order. I very much doubt whether the people who are saying that really know that much about Westphalia. I did a study of the prehistory of Westphalia through my work on Richelieu. And this argument, which is supported by French historiography, but also by German historiography, most of my work is derivative of this historiography, is that Richelieu did struggle over his lifetime to prevent the establishment of a European level Habsburg dominance. That was essential. And Westphalia was the permanent crushing of the idea of the Holy Roman Empire as a modern state. And so it may not have been spelt out in the treaty, but that was his preparatory instructions to his ambassadors. He did, according to my researchers, he was responsible for guiding the French ambassadors, their instructions to prepare the Westphalia. That took place after his death. He died, I think, around in the course of the 1642. But the groundwork was already there laid for a balance of power among relatively equal countries. And that is the essence of modern international law. So it is there, and its sociological or political foundation is set up and established and no longer contested with Westphalia, and then reaffirmed at Utrecht and Vienna. So I think that we are mixing up philosophy and history. And also, I think that many people who are now coming to study, or maybe this is just me being a bit of a troublemaker, but many of the people who come to study the history of international law are not international lawyers. And I'm not sure how much they understand this background. They will go and look at a treaty and they say, well, the Treaty of Westphalia doesn't contain any clause that says we are founding international law, and international law is based on the following fundamental principles. It's much more a de facto mechanism for ensuring that princes cannot be constantly interfering in one another's internal affairs or something like that. So history and philosophy are coming together. So I think it is no surprise that we are plagued with so many historiographical areas of dispute. That's inherent in the very way that we as international lawyers approach history, and in the way that legal historians approach history.
I'm obviously very amenable to your claim that history cannot be distinguished from philosophy and possibly from some type of morality and so on. I mean, history as a discipline is an extremely modern scientific idea. The idea that we can study in a scientific way the past, and that we're gonna establish the past as a fact. This is extremely modern, and obviously this is a type of modern scientificity that has been contested in that respect. I'm extremely influenced by the work of people like Hayden White that claim that history is not a science; it's just a discourse about the past, and the very idea of history is again, it brings us back to the Condorcet distinction between all these disciplines to organize knowledge. I've been very struck by something you said, though, which is the fact that most people in studying the history of international law are not actually international lawyers, and I wonder whether you're making a normative claim here. Do you think that to study the history of international law, one should be an international lawyer? Or on the contrary, do you think that international lawyers should leave the study of history to historians? What's your take on this?
Well, I'm merely remarking about it as a fact and wondering about it. And I think that we have a fundamental theme underlying our conversations, which is that the essayist, the essay form is preferable to the professional scientific form. And so I think that is going to intrude positively and give direction to all our discussions. So when you mention the notion of scientific history, then this is the historian's equivalent of the international law becoming professional. That the international law becomes scientific, history becomes scientific. So you have professional historians. Now, legal historians are possibly professional historians, but I'm not sure how useful their professional history is, because legal historians in German and Teutonic and Central European law faculties are historians of Roman law and canon law. They are not diplomatic historians. And so there is a bias there. There's a limit to their competence. So I don't think I'm making a normative claim there. Though I'm not criticizing any particular legal historians here, because I know that some of them do very considerable archival work, or have done very considerable archival work. But I do feel that nor do I really mind. I'm very torn about the quality and the nature of international law, but I was very impressed once by a colleague who said, well, international law is conceptually very weak, and really you can probably summarize it in a teach yourself international law textbook that you can read in an afternoon. However, it is actually based on a customary practice. And in fact, to get the feel of this subject, its texture and its elasticity, you really need to immerse yourself in it for a very long time. And without that, you tend to make pauschal, what the Germans would call pauschale, snap judgments about what the essence of this subject is, and not to be aware of its subtlety. And even though I argue against this myself, it is in a sense a tradition and a customary practice, and it's not fully explicit exactly what it is or what it involves. And so I'm not happy about the idea that historians of Roman law and canon law have a major role in the development of the science of the history of international law at the moment. And there's not just one person at that, there's a number. And I'm really not sure that they maybe bring too rigorous a professionalism to what is an amorphous subject. And they tend to be a bit dismissive of diplomacy as not really law. And diplomats are not really part of the picture. That raises the huge debate that I was invited to contribute to, though it led to some tensions and controversy in the Oxford Handbook on the History of International Law, the distinction between doctrine and practice. And when I tried to insist that the practice was actually defined by the doctrine, that led to a lot of trouble with the editors and a lot of tension. And so I do feel there aren't easy solutions there, because you see if you say the international lawyers can't do the work because they are not historians, and the legal historians can't do the work because they're not international lawyers, but the historians can't do the work because they're neither legal historians nor international lawyers, then somebody could do the work. So we have to come back to our concept of the essayist rather than the concept of the discipline. And for me, the essence of the essayist, which I think is your very important contribution, fundamental idea to our conversations, is that the essayist is an individual person who has a particular purpose. Now, if that purpose is not shared by others, then what he has to say or she has to say will not produce any response or reaction, though at least in the short term, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the work is worthless. Mm-hmm. I mean, for myself, that's how I have approached history, with a purpose. So I would not resist Hyde and White. I may not go the whole way, but this will be Carty looking at German international legal history, where I've done a lot of work. And Carty looking at Irish international legal history, where I've done a lot of work. My perspective, well, if there are not others involved in this discussion, then nothing much is going to come out of it. But it is, it's not purely essay writing. There are standards for archival and doctrinal and scholarly work that have to be, one is trying to observe. But it still comes down to whether or not, having just read the article by Adorno on essay writing, whether or not one is aiming at some kind of universally scientifically objective way of determining the entire field, which is what Leshofer is doing with his Cambridge history, or whether you're simply trying to address a particular series of issues, which you can only do so in a historical way because the history is the story. The history is where the answers are, if there are answers. I have thought that my take, as I've been thinking over this subject over the last couple of weeks, my take on the anachronism debate is that not only, well, following a little bit the postmodern approach of Hyde and White, I would say that we are part of nations. You are Belgian, I'm Irish, but very mixed. I have an Anglo-Irish identity as well. We are part of a historical community which does not die, which doesn't really have the past. The 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries are as alive in British psychology and psych-consciousness today as they were at the time. So, I mean, we don't have, like the Battle of Waterloo or the Battle of Trafalgar or the Treaty of Utrecht, these are alive parts of the everyday life of English consciousness. The row with Spain over Gibraltar, which is constantly ongoing, goes back to Utrecht, the Treaty of Utrecht, and so on. So the distinction is not clearly drawn, and one is, as an individual person, a member of this community, as I'm a member of the kind of British-Irish community, I take up these questions, which are really alive in the everyday imagination at the moment. Alive in the sense that they determine, and here I'm on Anna Orford's side against Leshofer, they alive in the sense that they determine the way people are actually behaving at the moment. And Adorno, maybe as a former or a neo-Marxist, is very dismissive of the idea that we have an individual consciousness existing at the present, which is quite separate from and distinct from the group history of our nationality in the past. I mean, this is simply not real and not true. So it's very, I think we are, I must say, I'm a bit like the bourgeois gentilhomme. I didn't realize I was doing history until the turn to history came about. And I had to say, well, that's what I've been doing all along. Yeah.
Well, maybe you were the trailblazer.
Well, I think if you think about Marty's work, which is treated as seminal, and we can enter the notion of which means canonic, so we can reflect on what is meant by canonic. I think that is also primarily a work of nostalgia, that he is thinking of a time when international lawyers did have some humanistic foundation to their existences between the 1870s and the 1950s, and then they disappeared into the European bureaucracy. And there is probably the same distaste for European law underlying Marty's book that I would sympathize with and I would agree with. So it's primarily a study of the international lawyer as the scholar, which to my mind explains why virtually absent from that book are the great political dramas that would have interested Wilhelm Greve and did actually underlie Wilhelm Greve's Epochen der Völkerrechtsgeschichte. That doesn't disqualify the book at all, but it is an essay, a very large essay or a series of essays.
Yeah, and this brings us back to this indeed, this running theme, this running thread, which is what are the best modes of engagement with international legal thought? And here the question is the essay a good mode, a good tool to engage with the history of international law? The essay as a tool of a historical engagement, and I do think the two of us share some sympathy for the essay as a tool, as a mode of engagement. I mean, I must say in that respect that if we go down the route of the essay, I think it comes at a cost, and I do believe that we should be ready to pay that cost. I'm all for it. The first cost is we should get rid of the idea of history, and we should actually get rid of the three first letters. What we are producing then are stories. These are stories about the past. These are not histories. These are stories. And I do appreciate that in the English language there is a distinction which I think is extremely valuable. It's a distinction you not necessarily find in other languages. So that would be the first, in a way, the first price to pay, which is maybe the end of history, the end of history as this scientific ideal. The second, it's also it's actually a consequence of this first consequence, and it's something you've touched on, which is that if we go down the road of the essay, we should come to terms with anachronism. I mean, this debate on anachronism is, I think, is a non-debate. If we are producing stories about the past, who claim? I mean, there's no way in which we should claim any scientificity. So being anachronistic is just inherent in the production of discourses.
I completely agree.
And I think this whole debate and is actually this whole debate is a remnant again of this scientific ideal, this idea that we should study the past in a scientific way. So in a way, if we go down the route of the essay, we forget about anachronism. This is a non-debate. We forget about, maybe that's polemical, but maybe we forget about history.
Well, there, I think that I would quibble with you, because I think that you are probably unintentionally equating history with scientific history. And history, obviously, I'm not much on the etymology of words, but obviously history is a story. It's the same word. They're totally linked. So you have good history and bad history, just as if you have good literature and bad literature, and good law and bad law. And to me, history, literature, and law come very close together. And I'm fascinated by the new historicism and the writing of Haydn White, but also Stephen Greenblatt and Marvelous Possessions, and his work on the Renaissance is just wonderful. And that has influenced me a lot in my history of Ireland. There was Ireland conquered, a history of Ireland. And I start off there. The main point I want to make in that book is that there are at least three nations living in Ireland. And of course, they're all largely constructions. At least they were made in the course of centuries. And you have the Gaelic, and that for a long time Catholic Ireland. Then you have the waves of conquerors, the English Anglican, and then the Scottish Presbyterian. They constitute three different nations. So was Ireland conquered is then a story about how the Ulster Unionists and Calvinists, particularly from Scotland, would argue, and the English Anglicans would argue, that Ireland was always part of England, or part of the same country, from the 12th century onwards. And that there was, it was not conquered because it was never a colony. And that's why you have the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And then when the Irish Republic broke away, you have the United Kingdom of Great Britain and the north of Ireland. And 2 points here. because for the Gaelic Irish, the country was conquered. And if the Cambridge History of the British Empire has its first volume on the conquest of Ireland and puts it in the hands of an Irish historian, Nicholas Canny. So the whole thing is controverted. There are different stories. There is substance in the different stories. And if you read the different stories, you do get some understanding of where the different communities are coming from. And I think we can't really do more than that. And for me, international law then becomes a hermeneutic, a dialectic and dialogue between different interpretive communities. And that's practical. I mean, I'm still a lawyer at heart. And I was very amused once when an economist praised us. I may have told you this before. He praised lawyers and said they were the best form of thinkers. And I said, well, my goodness, why on earth do you say that? And he said, well, it's because you have to reach decisions. You want to do things, whereas we just go on exploring facts and collecting more and more. I'm not sure that's true of economists. But anyway, for me, I want to know what can we do? So how do you, for me, then I apply that method for a dispute between Britain and China over Hong Kong. You have a British historical memory, you have a Chinese historical memory. We are not obliged, as you say in your international law as a belief system, we are not obliged as lawyers to come up with solutions. I mean, the patient may be pathologically sick and on the point of dying, and there's nothing we can do about it, but we can try and understand. So that, for my mind, there are good stories and bad stories, and we can't really say there are no histories. Scientific history is quite a recent phenomenon. I don't know whether one would say that Gibbon's history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, whether that qualifies as scientific history. I think we can agree that some of these histories are Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars. I mean, there are great classics of the human spirit, which are characterized as his stories because they are based on credible narratives. And but they are not scientific narratives. Now, I think Adorno's essay is very good on criticizing the philosophical assumptions and underlying the notion of a scientific piece of work, that it has to be universal, that you have to separate the subject writing it from the object about which one is writing. And it has to cover every conceivable situation, and so on and so forth. It's that part of his essay is very clear. Well, we're both resisting that. But maybe Haydn White goes too far, and sometimes Marty does as well, when he sort of says that history is simply a story that as I'm telling it, and somebody else will tell it differently. Well, superficially, I think that's true, but I think that we can still dialogue with one another and protest, well, you've written this history, but you've left out this, that, and the other, and what happened to such and such and so on. So I'm not so pessimistic. Basically, scientists are trying to make human beings into gods. The God perspective. The scientific perspective is the God perspective, but our perspective as humans is limited. It's limited by the size of our brains, where we are placed in time and in space and so on. And that's something which we have to accept. And I think a lot of the bitterness of academic quarreling is actually struggles to achieve the myth of scientific dominance. You know, if you have a struggle between the anachronists and the anti-anachronists in the history of international law, it doesn't really make much sense unless both sides believe there is a discipline and it had to have a particular shape. And if it has the shape they wanted to have, then they can control the whole thing.
Yeah.
Instead of simply saying, well, these two people are quite different and they're interested in different things. And the different things they're so interested in are so different that they're really not interested in talking to one another, which is nothing unusual about the human condition. Most of my explorations of German and Irish history don't interest anybody. But I don't give up trying and bringing them back and claiming that they are of some relevance and of some importance. So that's how I see it. So I don't agree with you. I agree with everything except the idea that you're giving up history altogether. I mean, giving up a scientific history is much more what you are actually doing.
No, and I'm glad you actually highlighting this, and that maybe my own critique of history is a critique of scientific history,
Yeah.
and actually this may bring me to what is possibly our last point today, which is the use of history in critique, and so it's actually something with which we started this sort of turn to historiography as something that has followed the rise and consolidation of critical legal thinking. And nowadays, especially if you look at the very fascinating work of 12 affiliated scholars, those scholars that look at look at law and empire, history is one of their main tools. And here I'd like to actually hear your view on a paradox I've been struggling with, uh, um, and which relates to the dismissal of history. And this is the idea that when you use history for the sake of critique, you actually engage in something extremely conservative. Because if you want to conduct critique by using the past and go on critiquing the past, you actually eventually rehabilitate the sort of mainstream markers of history. So, for instance, to make things very concrete, all these critical histories of international law, which have been flourishing in the last decades, they are still histories about white males located in Europe. There are histories about Grotius, there are histories about Vattel, about Lauterbach, and so there is no renewal of our imagination. So these critical histories, now when we say that Grotius was working for the Dutch state, or the East Indian Company, well, it's still a history with Europe as its center, and a history where the world is led by white males. And so I must say I'm uncomfortable with this. I'm uncomfortable with the idea that we have critical histories, because these critical histories, they are rehabilitate the empire. They rehabilitate these mainstream discourses with these leading figures, which are always the same. In a way, these critical histories, that perpetuates the center and the periphery. And so what I'm struggling, and that's why I'm putting this as a question. What do you think we can be critical when we do history? Can we be critical when we do history? Or are we bound to rehabilitate a sort of past with Europe and white males at the center? So it's a paradox. I must say I'm a bit struggling with, and I'll be very keen on hearing your views.
Well, I think you've raised a lot of questions there, and they're very important, and I've been thinking about them. And I'm not in a position to give you a scientific answer, because I know that, for instance, Anthony Angie is stimulating a new journal on the history of international law written by Asian scholars and African scholars and so on. And I need to keep up the breast of what's going on there. But I think that apart from Becker Lorca's work on South America, I don't think, I think most of the international law writing is doing what you say. There's another study, which I still haven't read, by Maria del Carre on China. But the work that we did when I was in Hong Kong on China and international law in the late 19th and early 20th century, I think tried to set up a dialogue historically. I mean, I was working with, it was the main advantage of being in Hong Kong. We had plenty of funding for postgraduate studies, and I had half a dozen mainland Chinese who were very good from top universities in China. And I was able to persuade them that it was worthwhile to study history of international law. And we went through the Chinese archives, as well as the Japanese archives, as well as going through European, French, and English archives on the struggles to do with China between the 1850s and the 1920s. And we managed to step to some extent outside this and to see things from the Chinese point of view. And I'm afraid that this may sound a bit too critical or not supportive, but I'm afraid that the representation of China in the work of Angie on its imperialism, sovereignty, and international law, I think was very, very superficial. I mean, and also others that have worked, I think Craven and Peters and others who have worked on this period, well, they present the power of international law as something very much greater than either it was seen by the Chinese or indeed by the Europeans, who did not have this stereotype of China as a non-existent country that was simply basically being shaped and constructed by Europe. So I do think that the historical work is still operating in an ethnocentric environment, which is actually psychoanalytically, and I think you cannot study the history of collectivities without having some psychoanalytical theory about collectivities, because they are inevitably very disturbed entities. And I think that the guilt process of self-loathing that accompanies this study of imperialism, not merely is it a form of self-torture, but it's also a form of self-aggrandizement. And I think that is what is crucially useless about it. That it really, the most important thing affecting East Asia at the moment is whether or not Grotius was really an imperialist, or whether Grotius is really a good guy. And so you have the dispute between Kotkaniemi, well, he's not the first here, Eric, oh, I can't remember his name now, Eric Smith or something, did an important work on Grotius. But you have Kotkaniemi and Janne Nijman. I mean, I do see that as, well, Janne comes as a Dutch person to the rescue of Grotius, and Kotkaniemi is critical of Grotius. And basically, who in Indonesia gives tuppence? Nobody. And we come then to a very fundamental point. When I arrived in Hong Kong, I said I wanted to study what was going on in Indonesia. And the Hong Kongers just laughed and they said there was nothing going on in Indonesia. So, basically, if we are to understand East Asia, we're going to have to accept that while there are some East Asians who are sent to study international law in European universities, these countries are not thinking in the same categories at all. So fundamentally, I think this whole debate about colonialism and imperialism in international law is an internal struggle for self-purification or a guilt trip or some kind of death wish within European culture, which has very little to do with the reality of East Asia. So I do think there is a crisis there, which is then, it's an incestuous internal debate, which I do think is leading nowhere, even though there are many Asians and Africans that are actually involved in this debate because they are integrated into the European culture. There are so many questions there, which is another whole theme. I do regard most of the discussion of imperialism and empire among Western international lawyers as largely worthless, in my opinion, but that's another whole topic.
No, and it's also a very polemical claim, possibly a polemical claim with which we will have to end our exchange today, but I think that's good for our audience. I think you've also touched on East Asia and international laws and global governance nowadays, which is, I think, something we would like to explore in one of our next dialogues.
Yeah.
So this is wonderful because you anticipate already on what we will be discussing in the future. So this has been fascinating, Tony. Thank you very much for this short exchange. To be continued, obviously. We haven't exhausted any question, but thank you very much.
And so much thank you. I thank you as well, Jean, for very stimulating partnership in our conversation. Yeah.
And to be continued.
To be continued.